My journey into the world of self-help began when, on my 12th birthday, my mum gave me a copy of The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, the teenage version, and on the inside she wrote, "Dear Catherine, who is always trying to improve herself." And one of the primary ways I was constantly trying to improve myself at this time was via relentless optimization of my time. This was during the aftermath of some pretty horrific sexual violence I'd experienced, and mastery and control over my time and ultimately my life offered a quick fix that seemed infinitely more appealing than dealing with my trauma. And so began many years of devouring time management books, resources, influencers, gurus, and anything I could get my hand on, basically. But now I'm at a point where I've come to realize that this whole industry just helped to cement some pretty toxic ideas about time that I've been trying to unlearn ever since. I've already talked about the colonial capitalist politics of time in my Time is Not Linear video, so this video is mostly about all the things I wish I could tell my 12-year-old self about the time management industry and the myths it perpetuates, and all the advice I would give her if I could go back in time. So the first myth of the time management world is that with the right tools and tactics, we can live as efficiently as possible, get more done, finally feel on top of things, and finally make time for what truly matters in life. But if we take a look throughout history, it would seem that the things that are supposed to make us more efficient don't actually free up more of our time, because instead of getting more things done, they just end up creating new things to do. For example, in her book, More Work for Mothers, the historian Ruth Schwartz-Cohen shows that when housewives got access to labor-saving technology like washing machines, dishwashers, vacuum cleaners, they didn't end up saving any time at all because society's standards of cleanliness just increased to offset any of the benefits. Artificial intelligence was supposed to make workplaces more efficient, to liberate us from working so much, but instead, since its inception, we're just working longer hours and more productively than before. Email was supposed to help us save time from handwriting and hand-delivering letters at a snail's pace, but instead, as the anti-self-help writer Oliver Burkeman put it, it's just led to this ingenious system whereby any random person on the planet can pester you at any time they like at almost no cost to themselves. And the issue isn't just that efficiency tends to backfire. The problem is also that the more efficient we try to be, the more irritated we become with delay. There was a time when my grandma was so frustrated with me because I just couldn't sit still and listen to her on the phone because I was so used to multitasking and listening to everything on 2 times speed that something as simple as having a normal conversation became intolerable and insufferable. And the more I adopted this efficiency mentality, the more it would creep into other aspects of my life as well. I started to feel pressure to use all my rest time and my leisure time productively too, which just led to constant restlessness. And trying to always optimize time just made me more unhappy with the time that I spent, because there were always more efficient, effective things I could have done with that time. So it seems to me that often the people most obsessed with efficiency end up being the most busy, frazzled, and for whom time flies by in a blur, whilst the people who care least about efficiency often tend to be the most serene, self-acceptant, and actually enjoy their time. I also find that trying to get rid of inefficiency just means that we also get rid of other things that we didn't realize we valued so much until they were gone. Discovery Channel gives me an easier entry point to nature via images of exotic destinations across the globe, which just makes me feel like I've had my nature fix and makes nature around me seem boring in comparison. So I'm less likely to go out and connect to nature around me, which just makes me more alienated from nature than ever before. I usually opt for self-service checkouts and ordering tickets online rather than standing in a queue or getting takeaway delivered, but I start to feel the loneliness of the loss of those little human interactions on a day-to-day basis. I would use dating apps to make finding a partner more efficient, but often it just leads to dissatisfaction with the partner you have because there's 1,000 potential better matches just a swipe away. And the more obsessed I am with making everything as efficient and effective and time-bound and scheduled and disciplined, the less openness I have for those little idiosyncrasies and serendipitous moments of life to emerge, like those chance encounters or following a curiosity or a gut instinct that takes us into a different direction, or those idle moments that lead to sudden epiphanies, or where the best ideas in life are often generated. So yes, efficiency might make things more convenient, but they're often a poor substitute or just a caricature of the things we really need. So I came to realize that efficiency is a trap. The more I tried to control time, the more it ended up controlling me. The second myth of the time management world is that it promises to eliminate all procrastination and laziness from our lives by teaching us the art of relentless focus and work. But as the psychologist Devon Price points out in Laziness Does Not Exist, laziness is usually a warning sign from our bodies and our minds that something is not working. Maybe it's telling us that we are sick, that we need more rest, that we're not living in line with our values, that our work does not fulfill us, that we're in a bad relationship that is clogging up our ability to concentrate. There are literally infinite things that our lazy, procrastinating bodies could be trying to communicate to us. But time management, instead of encouraging us to listen, often gets us to override the natural wisdom of our bodies so that we assimilate to a very white, cis, youthful, able-bodied, neurotypical man's body, which often doesn't work for people who don't fit into that demographic. I, for example, as a neurodivergent person, am often considered lazy because I tend to work in bursts of energy rather than in a very structured 9-to-5 type of rhythm. But if I follow the rhythms of my body, I often get the same amount done in one day as others get done in a week. In the same way, I'm often considered lazy because I go to sleep late and I wake up late. But according to the Why We Sleep book by Matthew Walker, the sleep expert, approximately 30% of the population have evolved to be night owls, and often I will end up working the same amount of hours as someone who works 9-to-5, but because I start and finish later in the day, it's somehow considered lazy or like procrastination or not as effective as someone who starts earlier, even though this is how my body has evolved to be. I was considered lazy at university because I spent about 3 months doing nothing but sleeping. But at the time, I had complex PTSD, and sleep is one of the best emotional processing mechanisms that we have. And I now consider it one of the best things I could possibly have done for my healing journey. I'm considered lazy at certain periods of the month because there are drastically different things I am capable of depending on what time it is in my cycle. Like, I tried to film this video a week ago, but it was 1 week before my period was starting, which is a nightmare in terms rhythms of energy, so I just couldn't get myself to film this video. And now that I am bleeding, I am full of energy and full of zest and spirit and feeling great. So working with the rhythms of my body is actually one of the most effective things I can do. I'm sometimes considered to be lazy during winter because I like to work with the rhythms of nature. And just like in nature, there are seasons of rest, dormancy, cyclicity, regrowth, fruition, reseeding, and composting. In the same way, I think our bodies also often work best in seasons of growth, seasons of hibernation, death and birth cycles. So in other words, often what is considered to be lazy and a form of procrastination according to the time management world is not really lazy at all. It's simply listening to the natural wisdom and rhythm of our bodies. And I think the opposite is often true too. Often the people considered to be the most productive and least lazy of all are actually the ones that in reality are the most unproductive and laziest of all. Like, have you ever met those people whose relentless productivity is sending them to an early grave because they're never taking care of themselves? So what looks from the outside like a great use of their time is actually knocking years off their life. Or there's the people who are so diligently working towards a goal, like writing a book or starting a business, that they never take the time to follow a hunch or a little curiosity or daydream when the moment strikes them, which, according to Bertrand Russell's famous book In Praise of Being Idle, is actually when a lot of our best ideas emerge. And then there's the people who are so stuck in the rat race and grind of life that they wake up in their 40s realizing that they've wasted their lives because they've never taken a step back to see the forest for the trees and contemplate if this is really what they want to be doing with their lives. And this is one of the reasons why these days, when I see someone who's incapable of being lazy, I often want to ask them, what are you avoiding? What are you running away from? Why can't you sit and be still and quiet with yourself? And I don't mean that in a judgmental way. I say that because I can totally relate. Part of the reason I got so sucked into the time management world was because, as I said at the beginning of the video, at 12 years old, I was so desperately trying to run away from my trauma. I would constantly do because I felt like if I stopped, all these feelings inside of me would finally come out. I was seeking mastery and control over my life so that I would finally feel safe and secure for once. I would use visualization and affirmation to disappear into a fantasy land of a future version of myself, away from the pain of the here and now. Meditation, yoga, spirituality was a way for me to disassociate from my feelings by disappearing into a Zen state. So for me, time optimization was just a very convenient and elaborate way for me to run away from myself. So I've come to realize that sometimes embracing laziness is the most productive thing I can do. And sometimes productivity can be a surefire way of wasting my life. Another thing I absolutely despise about the time management industry is that it gets us to value time for the purpose of working towards some future goal or reward. But I feel like this just wrenches us out from the present and stops us from being able to see the beauty in the here and now. Little mundane moments like cooking a nice meal, taking a walk, or playing with your kids are to be rushed through to get to something more important later, full of inconveniences and annoyances. And then what ends up happening is you may start to live not for what you actually want, but for what you think a future version of you may want. Like people who get married, have kids, or a high-paying job, not because they really actually genuinely want these things, but so they could feel on their deathbeds they'd lived a good life. In other words, we can start to live via signifiers of what is a good life, or based on what we think an imaginary version of ourselves may want in the future, rather than what we actually want in the here and now. And it wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing to live for some future goal or reward if it were actually worth it in the end. But anecdotally, it seems we've all had that experience of striving towards something, whether it's a dream wedding day or a job or a promotion, and then you get to that thing and it's so incredibly disappointing and anticlimactic. And often the most beautiful moments in life are the most mundane or unexpected, like a really great hug, or the moon at night when it's shining really brightly, or a night out with friends that ends up turning into some unexpected adventure. The things that I've strived towards in the past have often been some of my biggest regrets. Like in hindsight, I really regret trying so hard to get the best grades possible at school and uni, and I just wished I had enjoyed myself and had more fun and taken it all less seriously, because I felt absolutely nothing when I achieved my aims. And now all I have is regret that I didn't live those years differently. But even if you are someone who is ecstatic when you finally achieved that reward or goal and you think it's all worth it, what usually ends up happening is this becomes the new norm, and so now you need a new thing to strive towards, a new goal somewhere in the future. So the bar just gets higher and higher and higher. The Sapiens book made this point well when it said, "One of history's few iron laws is that luxuries tend to become necessities and to spawn new obligations." I also think there's some sort of iron law to life, that the most important, meaningful things don't have some sort of end point or end reward. I'm going to quote Oliver Berkman again because I think he makes this point better than I ever could. He writes, "There's a sense in which most of the most meaningful work in life, including the work of parenting, climate activism, building relationships, and everything else, has this quality of not being completable within our lifetimes. All such activities always belong to a far bigger temporal context, with an ultimate value that will only be measurable long after we're gone, or perhaps never, since time stretches on indefinitely. We're all in the position of medieval stonemasons, adding a few more bricks to a cathedral whose completion we know we'll never see. The cathedral's still worth building all the same." So I think it's kind of ironic that those of us who strive so hard for some future goal or reward to ensure that we don't have regrets are the ones that often get to the end of our lives and realize we've lived a life full of regret. Another myth of the time management world is that it's possible to have and do it all if only we master time management. But I've often found in life that the people most obsessed with doing it all often don't even end up making time for the things that matter most. For example, the best-selling time management book Someday is Today by Matthew Dix, which is highly praised by influencers like Ali Abdul, basically spends the whole time scolding time wasters, but then he proceeds to talk about how it took him years and years and years before he ended up going to therapy, despite the fact that he clearly had a lot of things that needed to be worked through. And I think this is so common because time management gets us obsessed with ticking things off our to-do lists because it can feel so rewarding, like we're really getting things done. Meanwhile, many of the most important things in life, like in my case, healing my relationship to my family, writing the book I've wanted to write for years, or sorting out my financial situation, always get pushed to the wayside because they're not as instantly gratifying as ticking 40 things off my to-do list. And I think this paradox of wanting to do it all but never actually getting to the things that actually matter is also true on a political, systemic level too. Like, so many of us are not actually sure of leaving a better world, let alone a living world, to our children. And yet we're all out here focusing our time on meaningless tick box exercises. The other problem I have with the idea that it's possible to have and do it all is that it's a lie. There are too many things to do that are equally valuable. Anytime we make a choice about how to spend any portion of our lives necessarily means closing the door on an equally enticing, potentially even better option. There's a reality in which I marry a man. There's a reality in which I marry a woman. There's a reality in which I have a child. There's a reality in which I live child-free. There's a reality in which I'm an anthropologist traveling the world. There's a reality in which I stay rooted and grounded in one place, building community and solidarity. I want to live all these realities simultaneously. And yet it's impossible to have and do it all. When pondering these irrevocable choices that we make, I always return to Cheryl Strayed's book, Tiny Beautiful Things, in which she references the poem The Blue House by Thomas Tranströmer, who's pondering the alternative lives he could have led. Every life has a sister ship, one that followed quite another route than the one we ended up taking. The sketches, he writes, all of them want to be real. Even if you're really content and happy with the choices you made, it can still be difficult to stop pondering our sister ships. My grandma, even though she was happily married at the time, ended up meeting at the age of 60 her ex-fiance from her 20s just because she wanted to take a sneak peek into this other life she could have led. Turns out he was still an arrogant prick 40 years later, so she was glad that ship had sailed. But I think the point still stands that instead of this myth that it's possible to do it all if only we manage our time right, I think it's better to accept that every life has a ghost ship that never was. And sometimes it's nice to take a sneak peek at what that life could have been. So I think trying to have and do it all is just a misery-making endeavour because we never end up doing the things that actually matter most. And it prevents us from having the peace of mind that can come from the acceptance that any choice in life inevitably contains some loss. So if I could go back to my 12-year-old self, I would tell her to put down the time management books, and instead I would ask her, in your quest for mastery over time, what are you running away from? What are you avoiding? How can you live your life in tune with what works for your specific body rather than externally imposed ideas of the optimal use of time? Why are you so desperate to improve yourself rather than loving and accepting who you are in the here and now? How would you live now if you knew you would fail at every goal or reward you had ever hoped to achieve? What would be worth doing with your time even if you never lived to see the results? If you never had time to do all you hoped to, what would you do differently? Which ships would you rather sail, and which ones are you willing to salute as they leave the shore? Ultimately, I think true liberation for me comes from changing my relationship to time itself, not seeing time as something to be controlled or mastered or disciplined or scheduled. Instead, I'm really trying to surrender to being present within time, to listening to the wisdom and the rhythms of my body, to accepting that laziness or idleness or whatever you want to call it is inevitable, to really see the beauty in the present and the mundane in the here and now rather than living for the future, and the acceptance of the inevitability of the ghost ships of our lives and the absolute impossibility of doing all that I want to do in this lifetime. So far, this has been a much more liberating and joyful way to live. There are 2 books I would highly recommend about time for anyone who's interested in exploring these topics further. The first one is the one I've referenced several times throughout this video, which is Oliver Burkeman's book 4,000 Weeks. The second one is A Sideways Look at Time by Jay Griffiths. You may also like my video Time is Not Linear, or Self-Help and Self-Care is a Scam, for more of a political, systemic look at these issues. Next week's video is also going to be about the self-help industry, so make sure you hit the notification bell and subscribe and do all the things if you want to see that. If you enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate if you would consider becoming a patron, liking, subscribing, sharing, leaving a one-time tip on Ko-fi or PayPal. If you join the Patreon, we have monthly Discord calls, monthly book clubs, and a Discord community in general you can be a part of. And I make extra vlogs on Patreon where I share things that are alive within me right now, things that I wouldn't put out in public. So feel free to check that out if you're interested. Thank you so much to my patrons for helping me to do work that fills my time with joy and excitement and meaning. It is a ship I am glad I have sailed.